in USA? Faithfulness is the word.
There's a place for you on the battle line. Engage in the fight for America's families. Visit AFA.net and then take your position. A message from the American Family Association. This is American Family Radio, the listener-supported ministry of the American Family Association.
American Family News, I'm Robert Thornton. Explosions were heard in the capital of Qatar as Iran launched missiles aimed at a U.S. military base just outside of Doha. Qatar condemned the attack but said it successfully intercepted the missiles and no casualties were reported. This as U.S. personnel in the region have been on high alert for such attacks. Some of the countries in the region have closed their airspaces. More from Fox's Rich Edson.
But the key bit of information that we're all waiting for is how the Trump administration is going to interpret what just happened. An American airbase, the largest presence in the Middle East, attacked by Iran. Iranians saying it's in response to the U.S. attack over the weekend. And whether or not this is viewed by the Trump administration is really an off-ramp here. If there were no Americans injured in this attack, if it was largely repelled, if it was largely symbolic so that the Iranian government could go back to their people and say, look, that we responded.
Fox's Jillian Turner has more on Iran's attack on U.S. forces.
It is probably too early right now to say that all hopes for diplomacy are now completely dead, but these Iranian strikes inside Qatar that we are witnessing are a definite and clear rebuke to Secretary of State Marco Rubio's pleas just yesterday for Iran to return immediately to nuclear negotiations with the United States. There's about a minimum of 8,000, anywhere up to 20,000 Americans, civilians on the ground inside Qatar. So, there's a lot of folks in harm's way outside the military base there that a lot of folks here at home are worried about.
A national defense analyst is questioning the justification for the U.S. attack on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. Here's a report from AFN's Chad Groening.
Following the precision raid that struck serious blows on the Iranian nuclear sites, the regime in Tehran vowed to strike back. And on Monday, they launched attacks on U.S. bases in Qatar and Iraq. The U.S. described its Sunday attack on the Fordo and Natanz enrichment facilities, as well as the Isfahan nuclear site, as a one-off to take out Iran's nuclear program. But Trump has warned of additional strikes if Tehran retaliates. Bob McGinnis is president of McGinnis Strategies, LLC, and author of a dozen books, including his latest, Preparing for World War III.
Last week, the press secretary said that Iran was weeks away from an atomic bomb, and that was a lie as far as I'm concerned. Politicians often lie. I know that surprised everybody, but when the Bush administration was about to go into Iraq, I was talking to the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and other political people, and they lied to my face.
And McGinnis says the result was disastrous.
We ended up wasting 4,400 lives, tens of thousands wounded, and up to date about $3 trillion. So I am skeptical. I do not believe that Iran was truly on the near path, 2 weeks, to a nuclear weapon.
And McGinnis says he hasn't seen any plan for regime change, which he believes must take place. I'm Chad Groening.
Fox says Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and other federal officials held calls today with multiple governors regarding the potential for attacks in the U.S. following the strikes against Iran. The DHS said the calls were not in relation to any specific threat, but rather to encourage governors and law enforcement to be vigilant. Fox also reports that today President Trump criticized Russia for suggesting that there are several nations willing to supply Iran with nuclear weapons. Trump made the statement on his Truth Social account, calling out former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who now leads Russia's Security Council. The first major heat wave of the summer is firing up across the eastern half of the country this week, with cities like Washington, Philadelphia, and New York City flirting with 100 degrees. Humidity will be rising, making it feel hotter. Some other places affected include Chicago, Cleveland, Louisville, and Raleigh, where it will feel like it's well above 100 degrees. And that concludes the news this hour. We do appreciate your listening. Find more news.
Back live soon. Thank you for listening. Back live soon. Thank you for listening to American Family Radio. Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Nurse. Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Nurse Mama Show, prescribing hope for healthy families here on American Family Radio. Here's your host, Professor, Pediatric Nurse Practitioner, and Mom of 4, Dr. Jessica Peck.
Well, hey there, friends, and welcome to my favorite part of the afternoon, getting to spend time with you, prescribing hope for healthy families. On the schedule for today is learning how to celebrate who God designed you uniquely to be. And my guest is here to share his story and his journey in that, We're talking to Nathan Clarkson, co-author with his mom of Uniquely You, exploring your child's extraordinarily distinctive design. This is so important in today's world as we see a culture that values uniqueness in a way that maybe we didn't value before. But kids, whether they were growing up then or whether they're growing up now, kids want to be seen, they want to be known, they want our children each individually. I know I have 4 kids and they are different as the day is long. It is a joy to see their differences, but it can be a challenge for me as a mom. So we're going to dive into this. How do we celebrate our kids' differences? So our guest today is Nathan Clarkson, an award-winning film and television actor, best-selling author of numerous books, a hit indie filmmaker, a podcast philosopher, and he lives between the lights of Los Angeles and the streets of New York City. And today he's going out on the radio waves with all of you, to all of our listeners. So Nathan, thanks so much for joining us today. We're so glad to have you.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Well, Nathan, just tell us a little bit about your story and growing up and what brought you to this place where you're sharing a book space with your mom, telling your story. Tell us about how you grew up.
Absolutely. Well, I was what you would call a different kid. I very early on was diagnosed with different mental illnesses and learning disabilities, and it was something that my mom, even before I was diagnosed, really started recognizing in me, both my behavior, how I was at school, how I was at home, and it was something that was very present from very early on. I can't remember a time in my life I didn't feel very different. And I was lucky to have a mom who saw those differences and cared about those differences. But in the world, whether it's Sunday school or at class or with friends, being different is something that can feel really alienating. It could make me feel very separated from other people, and it can even make me feel wrong. The way my mind worked, the way my personality worked was bad. And so it was something that was very early on. It was kind of a defining factor for how I began to see myself. And, there's a lot of negatives that came with that. But luckily, I was given a mother who saw those differences and didn't see them as things to fix, didn't see them as things that were wrong with me, but rather things to understand and help me through. And she did this through her perspective, which was through God's perspective of how God has created all of us uniquely, and that whatever uniquenesses I had, even the difficult ones, they were going to be used for the story that God was going to tell of my life. And so, long story short, fast forward a couple decades later, and I started noticing that all around me were people who were struggling with their differences, struggling, feeling alone or separated or bad or wrong because of the ways they were unique. And so I went to my mom and I said, Mom, I think we need to tell our story. And so we wrote a book together. This was our first book we wrote together called Different. And it was kind of a memoir, kind of a thought piece about our story, what it was like raising a different kid and what it was like being a different kid. And so we didn't think this book was going to go very far. We just a very niche subject. But what happened was the book ended up on the Today Show and the bestsellers list. And we started receiving thousands of messages from people saying either I have a different kid or I am a different kid. And so we said we need to continue this conversation. And we explored my particular differences with my mental illness and my learning disabilities. But what we really realized and really believe is that every kid is unique in a myriad of different ways. And so in this current book, in the book we just released called Uniquely You, we explore all the different ways every kid can be unique, whether it's personality or learning styles or discipline styles or love languages, so many different ways a kid can be unique. But that is why we wanted to write this book together.
So many questions, Nathan. This is so much to dive into. And there's so many elements that I love about what you just shared and parts of your story. But the first thing that I want to dive into and ask you about is you keep emphasizing, yes, you are uniquely you, created in the image of God. You are who God created you to be, a unique creation of God. And I think that that is something that we need to establish right from the very beginning, because when we look at today's celebration of difference, we see messages like live your truth or you do you, and we see these kids who have this pressure to image craft themselves into some way that's societally acceptable. But that's really troubling in cancel culture, because what's celebrated today is canceled tomorrow. And I feel like I see all of these kids who are constantly shifting to kind of figure out, who am I today and how am I different today, and is that okay today? But there is a security, there is a different kind of approach when you look at yourself created in the image of God, already created, already formed in your mother's womb. He knew exactly who you were going to be, the struggles that you were going to have. He knew exactly which mom to give you. What is the difference there in celebrating, your identity as a unique creation of God?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you bring up kind of the cultural elements of a lot of the messages that say, be unique, be different, and, be yourself. But what's interesting to me is I look across kind of the landscape of culture and I see these catchphrases over and over again. While there is a lot of lip service, I think, in culture to saying, be totally unique, you should be yourself, that kind of thing, I think actually underneath that is there's kind of a pressure to actually be unique in the way that they have told you to be, or be different in the way that a particular group wants you to be. And as I look at the philosophy that we're exploring in this book, it's not something that you're going to change about yourself. It's going to be something you discover about yourself that God has created within you. God, talks about in Scripture that He wove us together in our mother's wombs, that He intentionally created us with intention and purpose. And so I think a lot of the time when we go about saying, who should I be, we think about who else should I be? And what we really, really want to get across in this book is that God created you. Every aspect of you, be it your personality, be it your mind, be it your heart, be it your passions, was created intentionally by God, and it's a good thing. And while there can be difficulties, there can be struggles with the ways that we're different, they're also something to figure out, not get rid of or try to change it, rather lean into and understand the way that God designed us, so that we can use all of those elements that were put there in the story that God gave us to tell.
I think that's so encouraging, because in a world where there's just so many shifting sands, so many shifting influences, the way that God created you does not change. And yes, like you said, we live in a broken world, and so sometimes that comes with different challenges, but accepting that as part of your story and seeing what God wants you to do with it, I think that's where people are so inspired. That's the difference. I think that's part of what resonated with so many people, Nathan, when you published your first book, to say, yeah, that is something different and countercultural that we want to hold on to. And going from that book to writing this book together, your mom shared a little heartwarming anecdote about herself growing up and being in church and fidgeting, just shaking her foot, not even aware that she was doing it, but just feeling that pressure, like, nope, that subtle shake from her mom's head, that's not okay. There's a certain image that you have to project, and we feel that pressure as parents to mold that. But then she shares, being a mom later on and looking down the pew and seeing a little boy sitting there shaking, fidgeting. I can only guess that means you, but what was it like to work with your mom to share your perspectives? Because I'm sure that they were unique, no pun intended.
Absolutely. Like I mentioned, I was blessed with a mom who was also out of the box. She didn't only just try to understand me and revel in my uniqueness God had created me in, but she did that because she was a unique kid growing up too, and so she knew how vitally important it was to not squelch or oppress the differences or try to force them into a mold of expectation, whether it be culture or just friends or family, whatever. thinks a kid should be, but rather she knew as a different kid who grew up different herself. Like you mentioned, she was the one wiggling in the church pew, trying to sit still and pay attention. And so she was especially adept at raising a little boy who was wiggling in that same pew, trying to pay attention, and not seeing the behavior as evil or bad or as something to fix, but rather something to help focus, and seeing it as something that might actually just play. Again, I'm going to keep on saying this over and over, and I apologize, but these differences might just be something that plays into the story that God has for us to tell. You know, I look back and I think of all the different ways I'm different, and I have struggled with my entire life since I was being a kid. You know, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and as many of us know, ADHD is kind of where the wiggles come from, right? The wiggles and the lack of focus and the difficulty in homework and not being able to pay attention to one thing for a long period of time. And that was a real struggle, particularly in school for me as a kid. But as I look now and I look at everything I'm doing, you know, I'm an actor and I'm a writer and I'm a filmmaker, that aspect of me that was jumping from thing to thing, that was always having a new idea, that was able to look at a multitude of things all at once, has actually played into the story that God has led me into. So what I used to see as something that was difficult and almost a curse actually ended up being a blessing in my life, because I was actually given a vision by my mom for, you know, this thing in your life, you were made in a particular way, your mind works in a particular way, maybe this can be used for what God wants you to do in the world.
You know, as parents, I think it's a challenge, because oftentimes when we see traits in our kids that we may view at the time, if we're being really honest here, Nathan, as maybe undesirable or difficult to manage, overwhelming, we just have this overwhelming impulse to stop that behavior, to fix it, like you said. I love how you said, you know, that your mom helped focus that rather than fix it. And it can be really hard, but the honest truth is many of those traits that we see are traits that are in ourselves. Some of those we recognize, and so we don't want our kids to have those because we know the struggles that those traits have brought for us. And some of it is a blind spot. Like, we just don't see that in ourselves, but inherently we somehow know. So how do you balance, yes, okay, there's some struggles that come along with some of those things, like your own experience you're describing, but while also affirming the beauty of their child's individuality as created by God? How do you balance those things?
That is a great question. It's one I always really want to make very clear. You know, what we are not saying here is that when we talk about celebrating differences and accepting the uniqueness that your kids are made in, we're not saying that you shouldn't try to help or focus or train or create boundaries. That is not what we're saying. Because in fact, helping a kid focus and creating boundaries actually enables their uniqueness, their differences, to be used well in their lives. You know, my mom told a story to me when I was a kid, when I was really, really struggling with feeling so outside the box that I just couldn't fit in. I was constantly getting in trouble at school. I was constantly not being able to focus on homework. I was constantly, you know, et cetera, et cetera. My mom told me this story. She said, Nathan, this is actually an old book. Nathan, there, you know, we read it together. It's called The Black Stallion, and it was about a horse. And this horse was the fastest, it was the strongest, and it was wild. And the arc of the story takes place around this horse has so much power, but until it accepts the reins, until it's trained, it can't use its power for anything productive. And so over the course of the story, the horse is trained, and it takes the bridle, and it takes the training, and it ends up being the fastest horse in the race. But it had to actually accept the bridle and the training and the boundaries to actually use its power, use its strength. And that was something that I really took on for myself, is that these things aren't meant to be gotten rid of. These things aren't meant to be squelched or fixed. These are things that are meant to be trained and focused so that I can use all these different elements about me and about my personality, my heart, and my mind to win the race that God has asked me to run.
That is a beautiful illustration